So, this idea of reselling concert tickets, event tickets, and the fact that you will have to pay sometimes such exorbitant amounts of money. We've discussed this plenty of times on the show and actually asked the question, can something be done about this? And then we find out in Ontario, they tried to do something about this not that long ago, talking about introducing a new law that would cap ticket resale prices to avoid things like scalping and price gouging. And I remember at the time when I saw this saying, hey, how come we don't have this here in Quebec? Well, I guess the idea was let's see how it goes in Ontario first, and then we can decide perhaps if it would work to try it here. Well, if we're going to judge by how it's going in Ontario, it's not going anywhere else very quickly at all, because apparently the experiment there, I don't want to say it's been a disaster, but it's not working out well. Jennifer Quaid is a law professor at the University of Ottawa. She's an expert in competition law, and she is on the line. Thank you for being here this afternoon. Would it be fair to call it a disaster, or is that too much?
It's a pleasure to be on. Thanks for the invitation. It might be a little early to call it a disaster, but I think the early reactions, even when the idea was being floated, and the fact that there was already a history of this previously, where the premier sort of walked back his original idea and then came around 2 years later to try it again. The fact is that trying to restrict resale prices for very popular events carries with it lots of consequences that are difficult for a government to control.
Well, beyond a government to control, you're obviously assuming the players involved in this will go along with your idea, right? It has to work both ways, and that doesn't seem to have happened here.
Well, I think that the immediate sort of press coverage right now is on the World Cup tickets, and more specifically about the Croatia versus Portugal match that's going to be held in Toronto, because that's obviously an event that's happening in Ontario and is subject to the legislation. But the FIFA tickets went on sale before this law came into effect, and it was already flagged at the time that it was going to be imperfect how this was going to be applied to sort of an existing set of sales. And one of the problems is that you need to know what the original base price was, issue price, and how do you handle the situation where someone bought the tickets before and maybe resold them before this law came into effect. So there are a bunch of sort of transition problems with it, but I think the larger issue really is that when you have a huge amount of demand and you ban official reselling, you push the reselling underground because people want to go to that match and they're going to pay whatever it takes to get to there.
Which sounds like it would never work. I mean, if you're always having someone who would pay whatever that amount is, maybe it's a smaller and smaller number, but how do you even begin to regulate that? If there's a willing buyer and a willing seller, how's that going to work?
Well, you're asking the question at the heart of the matter, and I mean, some of this is cultural, right? We live in a society, at least in Canada, where for the most part people seem broadly to be favorable to the idea that prices are not set by the government, prices are set by demand and supply, although we do, of course, have regulations that govern the conditions under which certain types of buying and selling happen, and in particular when it affects consumers. But the solution is not always to just sort of cap the price, although that's one way of doing it. I mean, there are other possibilities, and I mean, Quebec has gone a different way in that regard, because they've decided that what you need to do is give people the information and make sure they can decide, and you sort of set the rules in play. We'll see whether that's only just sort of coming into effect, so we'll see whether that has a differential impact to Ontario. But the long and the short of it is, especially for events where you've just got so many more people who want to go than the space, I think it's sort of unavoidable that there's going to be people who will need to resell. If I've bought even if it's a face value $500 ticket to this fantastic football game tomorrow or soccer game tomorrow, if I need to sell it, I want to be able to sell it, right? But the second thing is, sorry, that's my phone. The second thing is that you just don't, you can't get away from the fact that there are going to be people who try to make money off this reselling. And it's going to be very tricky unless you want to go back to the analog world and people have to line up and get a physical ticket. And there are downsides to that too.
I wonder, though, at the end of this, whether government should get involved. I understand, it was a really great idea. At least it sounded like a great idea to think, in theory, that they could do something about this. The reality is proving very much different. But, at some point, if governments wanted to get involved, the idea would be, well, I have a ticket, I want to resell it. But in Ontario, I can only resell it through the government. I guess we don't want to see that happen.
Well, I mean, it's not for me to tell, average Quebecers or, Ontarians what they prefer, but I think there would be a little bit of discomfort with the idea that suddenly the government would get into the business of being a clearinghouse for secondary sales of tickets. I mean, the other thing that people aren't talking about is that event organizers, so FIFA or Taylor Swift or the Blue Jays or whoever it is, they can also decide that some tickets might be sold at different prices or might be reserved for certain special categories of fans, whether it's, Little League baseball players or whatever. But they have to make that choice, and then they have to, figure out how they're going to make sure that those special categories are respected. But I think that you're always going to kind of get up against this idea that someone's going to try to make a buck off a popular event. I would say my parting sort of observation is also that we're talking about entertainment for the most part. I think it might be different if you're talking about an essential service or something that somebody needs where, access is being priced completely unreasonably out of the reach of people who need it. But we are talking about, fun things. And yes, everyone wants to do fun things, but I think that's where, the choice about does the government want to get involved in actually regulating the price, I suspect for this kind of thing, they don't want to cross that road because it'd be politically unpopular, I would suspect.
Has any jurisdiction done a reasonable job of trying to deal with this that you're aware of?
Well, not that I'm aware of, but I think that, part of it is, how tickets are sold. So it's not just the fact that there's a resale, because there's always been a secondary market. There's always been a resale market.
Right.
We all remember the old days, or I'm old enough to remember when there would be these people skulking around in front of, for example, the Bell Center.
Yeah, they're still there.
Tickets. Yeah, and so that's always going to be there. But it's harder to do that at a mass scale when you have to physically buy the tickets and you have a number, 4 tickets per person, for example. It's hard to game the system. With digital technology, it's just made it so much easier for bots and for workarounds that I think that the even if, you want to give the benefit of the doubt to some of these platforms, it is hard to, they've got to keep up technologically, and that makes it that much harder. So I don't know somewhere where there's a silver bullet. It's probably going to be a combination of making sure people understand what's happening and they understand, when they're desperate to get a ticket, how much they might be at risk, for example, for fraud, but also understanding that, you're never going to eliminate the sort of profit incentive. And so governments have to decide how many resources and how much, basically surveillance they're going to do to try and really push these platforms to become the gatekeepers of good reselling practices.
So just as a final question, though, do you think there's a real willingness, from those sites like the StubHubs or SeatGeeks to actually want to play ball with governments or jurisdictions here on doing this? Is that really there?
Well, that is a fair question in that, certainly what they're saying right now is, yes, we want to work with governments because they have no incentive to say something otherwise. I think if you take a step back, one of the questions that, has come up, especially with regard to Ticketmaster, is, to some extent, do they have enough commercial power because they also control venues and they control artist representation? They have basically a piece in 3 parts of this overall live entertainment market. Does that mean that they have so much power that they can sort of afford to be, let's say, lukewarm on complying with the government because there won't be any alternative to them, or they are so dominant? That's certainly what the smaller players are saying. But I think there's a bigger piece of how this market is structured, and maybe it just has to be permanently broken up so that, there's more ability for smaller players to compete, and then maybe everyone's motivated to offer the right service. But there's no silver bullet, I would say.
We will leave it at that. Thank you so much for your time. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity to chat to your listeners. Bye.
Appreciate it. Jennifer Quaid, law professor at the University of Ottawa. So this is what's going on in Ontario, and it's not really obvious, as you heard, not working there. So expecting it's going to come here and work here, no.
Listen, and you're there for heart-wrenching knockouts,
the world's biggest stage,
and breathtaking triumph. 2026 FIFA World Cup. The knockout stage. Every match, every moment. Listen on TSN Radio. Join the globe on the road to the July 19th final. 2026 FIFA World Cup. Stream it all live on TSN Radio. Available on iHeartRadio.